gone down quite considerably. Your chances to hit have also dropped, since firing 4 big solid shot
Alright, it's
into such
been
a
a
target
little
would
bit
make
more
you
than
feel
20
that
minutes.
even assuming you
I
were effective,
blended in some more
that
colors. I was waiting for my battery on
unfortunately
my
there
phone
was
to
getting
charge.
towards increasingly long odds, not to mention that reload times had gone through the roof. Hence, the development of the smaller
I
secondary and
think we're
tertiary
right where
batteries
we
using
want to
shells
be.
filled with explosive designed to set everything on fire instead. But that's tactics as a result of gunnery, not specifically about the shells. But to be honest, even assuming you punched through the armour, frankly, a 17-inch hole in the side of a 340-foot long ship was unlikely to be immediately fatal, and although the shot would be somewhat hot from firing, even a hit to a magazine might just result in some bemused crewman stepping carefully around the annoying thing now wedged in the deck. Something capable of doing a bit more damage than an inert lump of metal was needed. The penetration had to be accompanied by devastation, and for this the Palliser shell and similar devices were looked to. They'd been dropped as anti-ship weapons, at least against armoured targets, because of the aforementioned issues with them simply exploding outside of the armour, but they were still carried for use against unprotected or lightly protected ships and some shore targets. With the new advances in explosive that brought gun cotton, dynamite, and everyone's favourite picric acid to the table in the form of lyddite and cordite, surely there was something that could be done to replace and enhance the effect of the old powder-filled Palliser shell. Sir Andrew Noble, a highly skilled ship designer, noted some of the problems towards the end of the 19th century. He said, "Firing against unarmed structures, shell charges with gunpowder do not generally explode until they are some short distance within the side of a vessel. But with gun cotton and lyddite, the shell may either be fired with a fuse and detonator so arranged that it will burst immediately on impact, or it may be so arranged as to give rise to a slight delay. In the first alternative, a hole of very large dimensions will be made in the side of the ship. In the second alternative, the shell will probably burst inside, making only a small hole in the side of the vessel, but the full effects of the explosion and the destruction of the crew would undoubtedly be serious from the explosion taking place within the vessel. Where an attack is made against thin armour, shell charged with gunpowder are more effective than high explosive shell, as the former cannot be got to pass through the armour and burst inside. I doubt if shell charged with any explosives can be got to pass through thick armour before exploding."
We'll just draw down on this,
See,
the
from
blue
this,
dots and the darker.
fuses seemed to hold the key,
It's actually like a real
as they
dark
could be
brown,
set
almost
together
black.
at the onset of the explosion, but many were quite hesitant about using them, as they had a long and unfortunate history of igniting and causing explosions when they were least wanted. One report of the time claimed that during the bombardment of Fort Fisher in the American Civil War, every single Parrott gun in the Union fleet had at some point burst due to the premature detonation of fused shells, with 45 killed or wounded by these explosions against 11 killed or wounded by Confederate fire. When it looked like your own fuses might actually be a greater threat to you
So
than
next,
the
I'm
enemy
not.
was,
It may appear
you can
first
understand
glance
why
there
people
I'm
were hesitant
shooting
to
for a
try and
weathering
adopt this
effect.
method. Advancement in this area was quite slow,
Close,
and
but
in
that's
many
not what I'm
cases it was
shooting
actually led by
for. What I'm
countries
shooting
with smaller
for is
navies that thus had ambitions to supplant
different
the Royal
colors
Navy.
of
The
steel, or
French in
different colors of
particular
rust
led
on steel,
extensively in the latter 19th
taking on
century,
different
to the
hues.
point that in the 1880s and
So when
1890s, many
I
Royal Navy
shoot
ships
the
had
paint over
imported
this,
French steel
when I
shot
shoot the white
to
paint over
supplement
this,
their still
and
carried
then we
Palliser
wet the
shot,
paint and start to
which
flake
at
it
this
off,
point was more
you're not going to
like a
have a
slightly molten
uniform
form of
one
barrow,
solid
more
rust
good and
color going
likely to go
across.
against a modern armoured vessel.
Just like when we start
The single biggest problem was fuse
that
sensitivity.
chipping effect,
In order to survive passage through
you're not going to
the
be able to
armour,
control the
the fuse
chips.
for any
You can sort of
solid
control
pistol
the area
shell
so it
had to
matches
be
the
in
photograph,
place. An
but not
erroneous
really.
fuse would either have to detonate immediately upon contact, or else be crushed into oblivion by the process of punching through the plate.
So you want to have that
But such a
different
fuse would have to be activated by the
non-uniform
fired,
surface
and they might
underneath,
survive,
because that's what's going to
but on,
pop through the
it
paint.
might still detonate
So I
early,
don't want
and
the
just
rust
because
popping
it's
through on
not
this part of the
working
bed
from new, more sensitive
to
lyddite
appear the same
shells.
color as the rust
Older
popping
gunpowder
through
ones
here,
really blew up early
or the
these
rust
days,
popping through here,
but their explosive power
and so on and
was
so on and
weaker
so on.
compared to other explosives that, for a short time, it was actually not really considered worth having them. This period would also see the advent of the common pointed shell. This simply moved the fuse of the common shell from the nose to the base.
So it starts to
As
take
the
on
shell wasn't for use on armor, the issues surrounding armor-piercing
a
shells weren't present,
3D,
but a slight delay meant that they
third
could lift the
dimensional
cover
type,
on armor
third dimensional
progress until
type
the common shells, as
appearance.
they'd at least be partially or fully within the target as they
If
went
I
on.
see where there's an area that's starting to look like weathering, then I'll back off of it. Kind of like these guys here. Or break it up a little bit.
And then detonating behind it with an explosive payload reliably began to enter Royal Navy service. But even at this stage, it was still using gunpowder for safety reasons. A year later, the Russo-Japanese War broke out, and it would be mainly the sheer size of the explosive charges in the Japanese Navy's shells, combined with the fires that they caused, that wrecked the Russian fleet.
There we go.
Indeed, at the Battle of the Yellow
Let's
Sea,
goof around a little bit more.
ships with the lyddite-filled armor-piercing shells either failed to
With,
detonate
let's see,
through the armor and
a more
outside
reddish
the target
hue
ship, or else they blew up on impact, which
here
looked spectacular, but didn't actually accomplish all that much.
and across
In
the top.
addition, almost a fifth of the Japanese Navy's heavy guns present were wrecked by premature detonations. Rather disappointed.
So we're not going to mimic rainwater, which you would do like this. We're just going to go ahead and spread the color out.
And swapped out chunks of high explosive for the more stable
That actually
gunpowder.
came out real nice
And
the
then
first
they
shot.
turned up to Tsushima with far more devastating salvos
Same
than
thing
the
here.
gun
We just,
and filled armor
if
piercing
we were
shells.
weathering, then we
Pacific
would
Squadron,
simulate rain effect by doing streaks going up and down like rainwater would do on the side of a steel structure like this. In this case, we're just going to spread this apart.
This combination on the Japanese side of the latest shells and explosives, quickly retrofitted in the middle of a war, finally delivered what most navies have been looking for: a reliable big gun shell. Albeit that the fires caused by the Japanese shells had done a lot more damage than armor-penetrating shots, and this tended to overrule many naval officers for a few years to come. Since large portions of a ship are not protected by substantial armor, it seemed better to use the common pointed shell, with its large explosive payload and minimal penetration, over the armor-piercing round, which was somewhat less spectacular in its effects, at least unless it hit something that was really important. The adoption of the big gun, however, was not affected by this, as, thanks to the square-cube law, the bigger the gun, the proportionally greater explosive payload could be carried, and thus the development of all big gun designs would continue unabated. Still, the fact that some of the biggest obstacles to a reliable armor-piercing shell had been overcome greatly encouraged the Director of Naval Ordnance, one John Jellicoe, who pressed for more work to be done in this area, since he wanted to be able to hit and sink an enemy with his guns, not just gradually attrit the enemy down using cumulative damage. This resulted the next year in
Hope you guys can see that.
a new type of
I
armor-piercing
got a lot of
shell,
lights on here, but
called properly armor-piercing capped, or APC. This combined the Japanese changes of fuse with a mild steel cap that sat atop the shell's nose like an especially jaunty hat. This worked to help the shell penetrate by flattening out, like soft clay or dough upon impact, something that should give you some idea of just how much energy was involved at this point, since mild steel is now starting to flow like Play-Doh. This would mean that the instant shock of a hardened steel nose meeting at the hardened plate armor of a ship could be expended in deforming the softer, mild steel cap instead of shattering the nose and then the rest of the shell. And thanks to the physics of high-speed impacts, the shock wave without the cap actually had two separate ways of breaking the shell. Obviously immediately when the shell hit, but
that
again,
technique there didn't quite work out the way I wanted.
when
This
the
part
shock
here,
wave
this yellow.
traveled back, having reflected
But you
off
can
the
always
rear
go
of the
back
shell,
with more mineral spirits in.
initiating the fuse. The shockwave then hitting the weakened and possibly already cracked nose and causing
Thin that out. Actually, this is an empty bottle. What I do is I go to the
is one of the reasons why when you
the
see
actual
slogans
artists'
like bullets hitting steel
stores, art
pipes,
stores.
they often seem to open
Get
out
yourself big giant bottles of
rather
this.
than just
A lot
firing
cheaper. I just use this as a refill.
Now, instead, with an arm-piercing cap, any shockwave ended up going out into the expanding ring of what had formerly been the cap and blowing that out instead, which has the helpful effect of adding a bunch of shrapnel.
No idea why my internet died right there. Connect, please.
Jeff Dunham, still not canceled, his all-new tour.
I make a living talking to myself, which means some forms of mental illness.
Doing a bit more damage than an inert lump of metal was needed. The penetration had to be accompanied by devastation, and for this the Palliser shell and similar devices were looked to. They'd been dropped as anti-ship weapons, at least against armoured targets, because of the aforementioned issues with them simply exploding outside of the armour, but they were still carried for use against unprotected or lightly protected ships and some shore targets. With the new advances in explosive that brought gun cotton, dynamite, and everyone's favourite picric acid to the table in the form of lyddite and cordite, surely there was something, but many people were quite hesitant about using them, as they had a long and unfortunate history of igniting and causing explosions when they were least wanted. One report of the time claimed that during the bombardment of Fort Fisher in the American Civil War, every single Parrott gun in the Union fleet had at some point burst due to the premature detonation of fused shells, with 45 killed or wounded by these explosions.
Now that one right there, I did kind of sloppy, but like I've said,
fire. When it looked like your own fuses might actually be a greater threat to you than the enemy was, you can understand why people were hesitant to try and adopt.
Add some extra mineral spirits, just clean that right up.
This area was quite slow, and in many cases it was actually led by countries with smaller navies that thus had ambitions to supplant the Royal Navy. The French in particular led extensively in the latter 19th century, to the point that in the 1880s and 1890s many Royal Navy ships carried imported French steel shot to supplement their still carried Palliser shot, which at this point was more than like a slightly militant form of ballast for all the good it was likely to do against a modern armoured vessel. The single biggest problem was fuse sensitivity. In order to survive passage through the armour, the fuse for any armour-piercing shell had to be in the base, and those based fuse would either have to detonate immediately upon contact or else be crushed into oblivion by the process of punching through the plate. But such a fuse would have to be activated by the force of the shell being fired, and then being live from that point on, it might still detonate early, and this problem was much more pronounced with the new, more sensitive lyddite shells. Older gunpowder ones rarely blew up early these days, but their explosive power was so meagre compared to other explosives that for a short time it was actually not really considered worth having them. This period would also see the advent of the common pointed shell. This simply moved the fuse of the common shell from the nose to the base. As the shell
there you go, you start to get some ideas. The idea of kind of what I'm shooting for. So let's do this real quick. And there's the paints we've been kind of dabbling into.
As they'd at least be partially or fully within the target as they went off. It would only actually be in 1903 that a shell capable of punching clean through the latest armour and then detonating behind it with an explosive payload reliably began to enter Royal Navy service. But even at this stage, it was still using gunpowder for safety reasons. A year later, the Russo-Japanese War broke out, and it would be mainly the sheer size of the explosive charges in the Japanese Navy's shells, combined with the fires that they caused, that wrecked the Russian fleet. Indeed, at the Battle of the Yellow Sea, numerous hits with the lyddite-filled armour-piercing shells either failed to detonate after passing.
So I put this under the air and it kind of dried it out there.
Target ship, or else they blew up on impact, which looked spectacular.
I don't know if you guys can see the effect.
Actually accomplish all that much. In
There's
addition,
a lot of
almost
reddish, bluish, actually purplish now, lighter hues.
Rather disappointed, the Japanese rapidly switched out the fuses in their remaining shells for some German ones that they had available, and swapped out
so what we'll do,
high explosive for the more stable gunpowder. And then they turned up to Tsushima with far more devastating salvos than the gun-cotton-filled armour-piercing shells of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, which suffered many of the same problems the Japanese had experienced at the Battle of the Yellow Sea, despite scoring numerous hits. This combination on the Japanese side of the latest shells and explosive quickly retrofitted in the middle of a war, finally delivered what most navies had been looking for: a reliable big gun shell. Albeit that the fires caused by the Japanese shells had done a lot more damage than armour-penetrating shots, and this tended to overrule many naval officers for a few years to come. Since large portions of a ship are not protected by substantial armour, it seemed better to use the common pointed shell with its large explosive payload and minimal penetration over the armour-piercing round, which was somewhat less spectacular in its effects, at least unless it hit something that was really important.
Sorry for being seemingly unprepared there,
by this, as thanks to
but we're working as we're actually shooting.
The bigger the gun, the proportionally greater explosive payload could be carried, and thus the development of all big gun designs would continue unabated. Still, the fact that some of the biggest obstacles to a reliable...
So we'll leave you guys with some close-ups of what we've done here.
Encouraged the Director of Naval Ordnance, one John Jellicoe, who pressed for more work to be done in this area, since he wanted to be able to hit and sink an enemy with his guns, not just gradually attrit the enemy down using cumulative damage. This resulted the next year in the development of a new type of armour-piercing shell, or more properly, armour-piercing capped, or APC. This combined the Japanese changes of the fuse with a mild steel cap that sat atop the shell's nose like an especially jaunty hat. This worked to help the shell penetrate by flattening out, like soft clay or dough, upon impact, something which should give you some idea of just how much energy was involved at this point, since mild steel is now starting to flow like Play-Doh. This would mean that the instant shock of a hardened steel nose meeting at the hardened plate armour of a ship could be expended in deforming the softer, mild steel cap instead of shattering the nose and then the rest of the shell. And thanks to the physics of high-speed impact, the shock wave without the cap actually had two separate ways of breaking the shell. Obviously immediately when the shell hit, but then again, an instant later,
the passenger side is done.
Back, having reflected off the rear of the shell, and also incidentally initiating the fuse, the shockwave then hitting the weakened and possibly already cracked nose and causing it to blow open. This double shock effect is one of the reasons why, when you see slow motion footage of bullets hitting steel plates, they often seem to open out like a flower rather than just piling up into a disc. Now, instead, with an arm-piercing cap, any shockwave ended up going out into the expanding ring of what had formerly been the cap and blowing that out instead, which has the helpful effect of adding a bunch of shrapnel to proceedings. This initial blow from the cap would also start to dish in or crack the armour plate itself with any luck, which in the next time would greatly help the armour-piercing shell.
We're going to go ahead and seal. We'll let this dry overnight.
It struck at anything other than a perfect 90-degree angle.
Actually, we'll let it dry just a couple hours. It's nice and warm outside. We'll put it in the sun. We'll hit it with a clear coat.
Sensitive enough, may not start to deform, and then the rest of the shell would just pile.
Then sometime this evening I'll hit it with the hairspray, and we'll come back tomorrow morning, hopefully, tomorrow being Sunday. We'll hit it with the white paint, and then we'll start the chipping effect.
The soft cap would just get torn off by the differential forces exerted.
I haven't really worked too much on the rear dump area.
A combination of these two factors would be the primary.
But what I did do,
for many British
I want
shells
to show you guys.
One, especially at Jutland. However, in 1906, these shells worked wonderfully, largely thanks to the then expected combat ranges of about 6 to 10,000 yards, not usually involving angles of drop much in excess of 15 degrees or so.
What I did do, the end of this extension that Tom Klein mentioned to me was for gravel use. I went ahead and peeled back all the way down to the bare metal. I peeled back the white paint to the bare metal, so it'll have that worn, but in this case it's actually real steel. Maybe we can get a reflection on that. It'll be a real metal effect as opposed to something I used in weathering or anything like that.
To safely operate, and the Germans, who had led in that particular field of technology in the 1900s.
So we'll do the dump bed. Actually, we'll do the swinging dump bed last. The inside of our dump bit is going to be a dark, almost black, oily color. Weathered up as it goes up. We'll have our torn canvas cover gizmo, and we'll attach all the chains and stuff. She'll be done. She's going to look like $1,000,000. And underneath, I'm going to give it basic sponge technique, a little bit of airbrush. I'm not going to go too crazy underneath. I'll hit it with some aged yellow, aged white, and she'll be ready. So it's very enjoyable. Thank you for joining me. I was real glad to share this experience with you guys today. As you can see, it no longer looks like a single uniform brand new coating of rust color, but rather has broken up with various hues. In person it looks 1,000,000 times better than I'm sure it does on camera, but that kind of gives you an idea. We'll let this dry. We'll put it in the sun right now and hit it with a clear coat, a glossy clear coat, probably in a couple hours. So thank you for joining me. Very relaxing. I could keep doing this all evening long. I actually worked on this part today with you guys, and I worked on this part. I finished it up before I shot the video a couple hours ago, and you can see different variations. Just a lot of fun. I had globbed on a piece of black here and I couldn't get rid of it, so I backtracked by adding some white on top of it. It's just, you can't make a mistake doing these techniques, using these products. You can go back later, many days later, sometimes a couple weeks later, and back off those products. It's fantastic, fantastic. I highly encourage anyone who's willing to try using these techniques. All right. Well, you guys have an awesome rest of your Saturday. If I don't talk to you tomorrow, have an awesome rest of your weekend. You guys take care, and we will see you in the beginning of May 2023.